Welcome to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. And if this is the first time that you're joining us for Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, this is our weekly live show where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest questions that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem, including data center operators like co-location providers, hyperscalers, edge computing related companies, modular data centers, wholesale data center providers, as well as data center technology and data center facilities related companies, data center construction, real estate and investment kinds of companies, as well as the vibrant outsourced sales and marketing ecosystem in and around data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. If this is the first time that you're joining us for Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us. And please let us know in the comments where you're joining us from and what you do in the data center industry. If you've been with us here before, welcome back. We love to have our frequent flyers joining us as well. And this is highly relevant for you, regardless of where you sit on your go-to-market team. Perhaps you work in some facet of marketing, like digital marketing or event marketing or social media or product marketing or channel marketing, or perhaps you do something related to sales, like as an account executive or sales development rep, an SDR or a BDR, or perhaps it's post-sales. You work in some facet of like account management or client success, or maybe you're on the product or innovation side, or perhaps if your company has an indirect playbook as well as a direct playbook, maybe you work in channel partnerships, or perhaps you're the one who's responsible for going out to the marketplace and finding the best and brightest and motivating them, selling them on your vision and why they should join your company, why they should join your team. Perhaps you're the executive sponsor who's responsible for going out and getting the right people on the bus in the right seats, rowing the boat at the right speed, playing their musical instruments at just the right time, at just the right tempo to make that magical symphony of growth happen throughout the global data center ecosystem. But regardless of your role, Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A has something for you, regardless of what part of the data center ecosystem you are part of, and regardless of where you are located anywhere in the world. We've had guests on our podcast from all 6 continents. If you're still working on Antarctica, if you know someone who does something in the data center ecosystem in Antarctica and you want to facilitate an introduction, that would certainly check off something on our bucket list. So what is on the agenda for today? What are the topics that we're going to be addressing? First, we're going to look at how a co-location, managed, and cloud hosting and disaster recovery business generates leads. Then we'll turn our attention to how an IT operations and incident response management company can attract very large MSPs, managed service providers. After that, we'll look at how a data center infrastructure provider can address managed IT services and cloud price competition. After that third question, we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's show, we'll talk about how a data center solutions company can generate more leads, how a data center construction and engineering company markets and sells more cooling projects. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll look at how to boost wholesale data center lead quality in a highly competitive marketplace. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address on an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching, and we'll add that to the consideration queue to address in an upcoming episode. And if you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to our Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox on Sundays. You can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So without any further delay, let's hop into this week's first question, which brings us into the data center operator space. A little bit of data center technology, mostly data center operators. So first up, how does a colocation, managed services, cloud hosting, and disaster recovery business generate leads? So that is a company that's primarily in the business of colocation, managed services, cloud hosting, and disaster recovery generate leads. So that's actually a pretty common combination to find in data center infrastructure companies, data center providers, data center operators that have like 4 different boxes on their homepage or 4 different areas on their services menu when we look at their website. And colocation, meaning that companies can co-locate, can take their servers and have them live inside of your data center, so they have access to your space and your power and your cooling and potentially infrastructure through your cross connects and meet me room telecommunications relationships. In addition to that, it's very common for companies like that to also offer some baseline managed services in their programs, especially on their higher level, more premium offerings. In many cases, they'll also offer additional managed services for a fee, either on a productized service basis or on a custom basis. Or in some cases, if your company doesn't want to provide managed IT services at all, you likely have relationships with outsource companies in your area that you can recommend to your clients, to your tenants, that they can contract with to get those IT services provided on their servers in your facilities, or in many cases, you're providing all of the above. So that's the co-location on the managed services side. Cloud hosting, some companies that are co-location operators will have direct connect relationships with the big hyperscalers, big public hyperscalers like Google, Amazon, and been a long morning, and Microsoft. In addition to that, it's very common for colocation operators to also have private cloud offerings that they offer that compete directly with the public cloud offerings. And it's also super common to have the ability to mix and match and customize those different offerings. So you have clients that have some of their infrastructure running in traditional colocations, some of it running in public cloud, some of it running on your own private cloud, and multi-cloud and hybrid cloud, all different kinds of arrangements to suit their needs. And disaster recovery, should probably go without saying that in the world we live in now, that most colocation operators that are selling to small to mid-sized companies definitely should be getting involved in conversations about disaster recovery, because it's not a great assumption to think that your clients have thought enough about it to really have a reasonable plan. But yeah, this isn't just about upsells and cross-selling and land and expand. This is about responsibility to help your clients with their total soup to nuts, comprehensive, outsourced IT services type of relationship. And yeah, disaster recovery is definitely part of it. That's also where small co-location operators are often drawn to the idea and the realization pretty quickly that a single location co-location operator really can't help their clients with disaster recovery because of that single point, because there's no redundancy if your particular facility has outage. And for the most part, in order for a co-location operator that's relatively small to be able to scale up to sell to mid-size and more enterprise kinds of clients, where you have increasing levels of sophistication among the IT decision makers, and at the same time increasing levels of budget, increasing levels of consequences for things going well and not so well. This is for sure what causes co-location operators to, if they don't want to open their own facilities, to start having relationships with a second, third, fourth, and so on operator who's in a completely different geographic location from where they are, where they rent space on a wholesale basis and essentially sell that on a retail basis. So yeah, those are definitely some things that come up when those 4 services come to play. So the question is, when it comes to your lead generation, are you selling all 4 of those services to the exact same kinds of clients? Are you able to sell co-location, managed services, cloud hosting, and disaster recovery to the exact same clients? Or do you have certain clients that are buying one of those, kind of cherry picking you, and not all 4? Generally, the smaller your company is, the more likely it is that the best fit kind of client for you is one that wants that single point of contact and doesn't want to have the blame game, doesn't want to have finger pointing between different data center operators. So it's very likely that your single program takes all of these into account. The only time when it becomes really tricky regardless of what your size is, what your business size is sometimes if your company has grown through mergers and acquisitions, as is actually quite common in the co-location space. If I look at the co-location businesses that I worked with 10 years ago, and just about all cases, the owners have subsequently exited. They've sold to bigger companies, and in some cases, those companies have sold to bigger companies because over time, one, there's unit economics. There's companies want coverage in a certain region. It gets a lot more expensive to be in the co-location business. You used to be able to run a pretty good business in the low to mid seven figures or your local currency equivalent. Now it's really hard to do that without having at least another zero after your revenue. So all of those considerations and then of course, if you're building facilities from scratch, wow, that's a completely different ballgame today than it was as recently as 5 years ago, where just the plans, the zoning, everything to get to the point that you're ready to put a shovel in the ground. And in most major markets around the world, those used to be 7 and 8 figure investments. In most cases, they're 8 and 9 figure investments now. Again, just to get to the point that you're ready to start construction. And again, these facilities are an order of magnitude larger than they were as recently as 5 or 10 years ago. So when it comes to lead generation, as long as you have an existing business where you've shown the kinds of clients that can be successful with you, that get good value from working with your company over an extended period of time, where you've had retention over a period of several years, then usually the place that makes the most sense is to try to clone your existing client list. So what that means is we're looking at which clients generate the most revenue, which generate the most profit, gross profit and net profit, which are happiest, have the highest net promoter score, which your team enjoys working with the most. And that collection of attributes there will help you get to your ideal client profile. For a lot of companies, it can be as simple as looking at your website and looking at your logos for the clients that you brag about working with, looking at your reviews, your case studies, your testimonials. And that often gives us criteria that we need to have that ideal client profile. So we know geographically where they're located, how big or small their companies are in certain industries that are a better match than others. Let's tackle each of those in turn. So geographically, going back probably a good 15 or 20 years at this point, the small to mid-sized clients that pick a co-location provider are usually very heavily biased towards picking facilities that are located where they are, either located where their office is, located where they live, or a little bit of both. So have you ever heard the term server hugging, where they want to literally be able to go to the facility and touch the boxes? Is very real. And they can do that with your co-location facility. They can't really do that with AWS or Google Cloud or Azure with a public cloud facility unless they're a huge enterprise client. And even so, there's considerable restrictions on how that comes to play. So yeah, they pick co-location a lot of times because of proximity. And because of that, the relationship with the staff in that particular facility matters quite a bit. So with all of that in mind, I've found across the board that about 80% of co-location revenue that's coming across the board is usually local and hyper-local clients that can drive to your facility 30, 60 minutes away within a 30 or 60 minute radius. Another 15, 20% or so of that revenue, however, may be coming long distance. And what does that long distance mean? Where they're not located locally, but there's a client need or a partner need or a latency need or a governance need that says that they need to have IT infrastructure in a particular geographic market. So what that means is not only are they there's a chance that they're traveling to your location initially to do some diligence before they sign up, but it's also equally possible that most or all of that sales process happens long distance over webinars, over Zooms, over watching videos. So those two boxes, essentially, local, hyper-local marketing versus long distance marketing, definitely influence how you generate leads efficiently. But at the end of the day, once we have that ideal client profile, from there, you should be able to develop a target account list of your top 100, top 500, top 1,000 accounts, whatever it is, that fit that criteria. that are located in close proximity. Oh, size is a big, employee size, employee headcount is a big deal as well. The reason that that's a particularly big deal is with co-location, you likely have productized bundles, you likely have productized offerings that scale based on how much space and power that they need. And as a result, you know your minimums. As a result, there usually is a pretty well-defined bottom of the market, at which point, like, a client's company may be too small to afford your minimums. Again, only you know that. Well, let's say, for example, you're in the US and your least expensive co-location offering is $800 a month over a 36-month contract. So you need to ask yourself how much success you've had in the past selling $800 a month co-location to companies with less than 10 employees, with less than $1 million in revenue, or your local currency equivalent. If for some reason you've found some isolated part of the market that's outrageously influent, that's always VC backed or something like that, and they can't afford it at that really small size, if not, like, you can dramatically increase your efficiency by saying, okay, for our minimum level program, we really don't want to waste a lot of effort on companies with less than 10 employees, or maybe even less than 50 employees. The upper end of the range, typically enterprise clients, like really big Fortune 500 kinds of clients with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of employees, I'd love to tell you that they're open to buying co-location from everyone. The reality is, the bigger the company is, the more they perceive that a safer option is buying from the larger companies. So if you are in a sales or account management role or marketing role for one of the biggest data center operators on the planet, like Equinix or Digital Realty or NTT Global Data Centers or something like that, fantastic. There's no upper limit on the company size that you can be marketing and selling to. If you work for a co-location operator that's a single location or has a handful of locations or something like that, a probably more self-aware approach is to recognize that over the years of your business, you've likely figured out that your sweet spot maxes out at a company. What your largest clients that you've been able to market, sell to, service, and retain with reasonably high satisfaction maybe is up to 1,000 employees, maybe it's up to 5,000 employees or something like that. So when it comes to defining the company size part of your ideal client profile, there's some very realistic things that come up with both affordability and clients being so large that their integration requirements or financial requirements or legal requirements, or just in general, the size of their team versus the size of your team, all of the above may give you a finite ceiling on how big of a client you want to have in that ideal client profile showing up in your target account list and you want to be generating leads from. Then there's also industries and niches that come up, and that's especially relevant for a company that's in co-location, managed services, cloud, and disaster recovery. If you're selling to regulated industries and you've invested in the credentials that make it possible for you to successfully market, sell, and service clients in regulated industries, that's fantastic. That should be specifically mentioned in your ideal client profile. That should be specifically addressed as you build out your target account list, as you build out your buyer personas, as you build out and implement your lead generation strategy. Conversely, if there's certain regulated industries where you know you're going to be immediately disqualified because you don't have that certification, that credentialing, that accreditation, well, you need to note that as well, because you don't want to waste time on ad campaigns or outbound or nurturing leads or sales process or anything if you know you're going to get knocked out because that particular kind of client, say they're in education or government or something like that, is going to ask for something that your company just doesn't have the ability to provide for them today. So yeah, those are like the three facets of your ideal client profile that are super critical to nail down before you start thinking about lead generation. And once you have that ideal client profile nailed down on the company side, then we can talk about the individuals within the companies. Because when it comes to lead generation, yes, it's great to have multiple people in a single company that you've generated leads with, that you're educating and building trust with at scale. And that's a really smart approach to improving the surface area of the decision-making committee. But in order to get the individual people to pay attention to your company in the first place, we need to know who those individual people are and what they care about, what's going on in their world. And some of the things that they care about that are going on in their world will intersect pretty well with what you do. Other things will be more indirectly related to what you do. But let's say, for example, for this co-location managed cloud hosting disaster recovery company. Let's say your primary buyer persona is a IT leader of a mid-market company in your geographic region that has anywhere from, say, 50 to 500 employees or 50 to 1,000 employees. And you've noted that when you go look at a stack of LinkedIn profiles from 5 or 10 representative people in that space, or you interview in person or video interviews or do surveys with 5 or 10 people in that space, or you look in your CRM for 5 or 10 representative people in that space and you study all the notes and all their interactions that they've had with your company over the years, you're able to boil that down to a handful of their biggest goals and a handful of the biggest challenges. On the goals side, these are typically either individual team goals or company-wide goals that have to do with digital infrastructure. And they'll often show up, these professional goals show up in their job descriptions. They'll show up in the summary on LinkedIn of how they describe who they are and what they do. Either the summary that's at the top of the profile or the summary that's specific to that particular job. It certainly shows up in their objectives and key results, but you have to have a pretty good trusted relationship with that prospect or client to get them to tell you what their objectives and key results are. That's not something that they typically advertise, but if you do a good job as a trusted advisor, that information will often be shared with you in a trusted context. So that's how you figure out what's going on in their world, what they're trying to achieve individually, that their team's working on, their company's working on. And we're looking for a handful of those topics because that's super relevant to getting your lead generation strategy to be very client-centric. The flip side of that is we also need to know what they're struggling with, what they're stressing out the most about, what is driving them nuts, their biggest challenges when it comes to anything and everything that's directly or indirectly related to digital infrastructure. And that's a little bit more challenging without asking people directly. People typically don't write in a job description. In some cases, it may be there. It's definitely not in their summary paragraph sitting on their LinkedIn profile what they're struggling with the most. But guarantee if you start doing lead generation right and you ask 100 IT managers that are in your ideal client profile that are sitting on your target account list, what's your biggest IT infrastructure challenge? 50 will probably completely ignore you. 10 or 20 of those will give you answers that are 1 or 2 words that won't be terribly useful. But if you ask 100 people on a landing page form to what's your biggest IT infrastructure challenge, you're going to get a couple dozen really good answers. So that alone can be super helpful, both initially and on an ongoing basis to iterate with your lead generation strategy. And then once you know those 5 or 6 big, most common goals that come up with that segment, and their 5 or 6 biggest challenges that come up with that segment, that top 10 list, that top 12 list is what I recommend that you utilize for your events schedule for the next 10 or 12 months. So if you have 10 or 12 topics, like 5 or 6 big goals that they're working on, 5 or 6 big challenges that they're struggling with, you have 10 or 12 topics. And what I'd highly recommend, if you want to really send your lead generation impact through the roof, is to once a month tackle one of those topics as a in-person event. What do I mean by in-person event? Well, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, most of your prospects and clients are likely within a 30 or 60-minute drive of your location. And what seems to work exceptionally well and continues to work exceptionally well, even in the AI-driven era, is inserting your company into your prospects and clients' professional development and learning and development. How do you do that? Well, for each of those hot button topics that come up, those biggest goals or challenges, you're basically need to get into the education business. So for example, if one of the big goals is to have more secure implementation of artificial intelligence, what you'd look to do is among your internal subject matter experts within your company. This is again why it's so important to have CEO level buy-in or C-level sponsorship on this kind of initiative, is if you're truly trying to turn the corner to get out of the vendor box and be seen more like teachers and consultants and subject matter experts, trusted advisors, maybe even thought leaders, part of that is consistently showing up early and often in the buyer's journey in a way that positions your client-facing team members as some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to anything and everything having to do with co-location, managed services, cloud, and disaster recovery. And a lot of that starts with taking inventory of who knows what within your company, the big topics that have come up, and who can sign up once, twice, maybe 3 times a year to give a half hour, 45-minute talk on that particular topic that's so good that you're highly confident that if they took that presentation topic and they took those slides to any national or global conference, you're highly confident that they'd be one of the highest rated sessions at the entire conference. So from a logistical perspective, most companies that have decent sized co-location facilities usually have a conference room that can seat 10 or 20 people comfortably. Many will have a classroom. Certainly everyone has a foyer. As long as you have a place where you can comfortably seat 10 or 20 people, these aren't designed to be huge events. They're designed to be very relationship building kind of events where you're inviting very specific people from your target account list and these specific buyer personas. And you're talking about topics that you know are top of mind with them. And it's hyper specific to who they are and what they care about. And the hardest part is getting the first session or two going, because if you do this right and you're providing a ton of value, one is you should be super confident that the person that's speaking on your side is going to provide a ton of value. Otherwise, you're going to sabotage your best efforts with all of this. But as long as you're super confident that your internal subject matter expert has great content, great unique expertise to be able to share with your prospects and clients, this is incredibly powerful. So for example, when someone registers, if you want to meet more people from that company, improve your surface area in that company to eventually meet the entire decision committee, just simply send an email back, a simple marketing automation, email marketing automation that says, hey, when it comes to having secure AI infrastructure, it's a team effort. We know it takes a village. There's typically people involved from operations, IT, cybersecurity, compliance, finance. So with that in mind, who else from your company, who else from your team would benefit from attending? Be shocked how that simple exercise of prompting people of like, oh yeah, and they hit the forward button on their email. Next thing you know, you're looking down at your lunch and learn or your breakfast seminar registration list, and you have clusters of people from the same company, which is awesome. I'll tell you why in a minute. The reason it's awesome is one of the biggest challenges that account executives have now is in a self-driven buyer's journey where they just really don't want to spend much time talking with sales anymore. The biggest struggle a lot of times is to help your internal champion drive alignment internally, to be kind of the coach of helping them get the right people thinking about talking about this kind of initiative. And if you wait to do that until they're almost all the way through the buyer's journey, in many cases, it's too late. You've missed the formative stages where you're able to shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all the available options that are in front of them for colo, managed services, cloud, and DR. But if you can arrive early and often, and that's the key thing with not only arriving early as a teacher and a consultant and subject matter expert, trusted advisor, but often when I talk about you have 10 or 12 topics, get 10 or 12 months, literally every single month, invite those several hundred people from those 100 or 200 companies to your breakfast seminars, to your lunch and learns. Obviously, not everyone's going to RSVP, not everyone's going to attend, but the ones that are super interested in that topic and learning from your internal subject matter expert, they will attend. And when they learn a lot, they're going to be really receptive the next time around. When you say, hey, who else should attend? They'll be like, oh, wow, I learned a ton. This was definitely well worth it. I'm going to bring my team lead next time. I'm going to bring my system administrator next time. I'm going to bring my boss next time. And then before you know it, you're proactively driving alignment in the part of the buyer's journey when you can really make a huge dent in shaping the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different options in front of them. You're teaching them your best practices. You're teaching them the methodologies, and you're essentially helping to establish the criteria that they're going to use to evaluate all the different options in front of them. So this inviting and getting the RSVP to attend gets you on the short list, doing a fantastic job with implementing this kind of educational program over a period of several months. Not only keeps you on the short list, it knocks your competitors off of the short list, because when they start spending so much of their learning development and professional development time with you, you're starving time and attention away from your competition. So it's really a beautiful, magical thing. And if you've ever schlepped your team to national and global conferences, you know firsthand how crazy expensive it can be with hotels and flights and food, and not to mention that if you rent a booth, it really, really skyrockets out of that. The interesting part with hosting your own educational events is not only do you get to control the topic, not only do you get to control who gets invited, those two things alone are extraordinarily rare when you're speaking at someone else's event or exhibiting at someone else's event. But the cool part, they cost almost nothing to produce relative to national and global conferences. Really, I mean, if you have a conference room or a classroom in your facility and you already have an email marketing program and a CRM, those two things are already paid for. They're amortized, long covered long ago. So like when you're talking about inviting people in for a breakfast seminar at Lunch and Learn and your room seats 15 or 20 people, this is not going to be something that you're going to need a lot of big approval from your boss to be able to cover. I've seen people do these events and they're out of pocket for bringing in bagels and pastry and coffee or something like that in the morning, or something like equivalent to that for lunch, like pizza, salads, deli, whatever it is, a few $100s, maybe $1,000 or $2,000 relative to the cost of these big national and global events where you're spending tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is the reason why you can afford to do these events very, very often, every single month. And if you really know what you're doing and you know who your secondary buyer persona is, and you know who your tertiary buyer persona is, and you get good enough at that, there's no reason why the first week of the month you have your event for your primary buyer persona. The second week of the month, a week later, you have your event for your secondary buyer persona. The third week of the month, heck, you're having your channel partners and your managed service providers and your integrators in for their Lunch and Learn or their breakfast series. And maybe the fourth week of the month, you do your long distance version of this, because remember I mentioned earlier, 80% hyper local, but 20% long distance. Basically take the same slides, take the same registration page, and you repurpose the in-person event to be a webinar for the exact same audience that wasn't able to attend in person and or will never be able to attend on a regular basis in person because they live a plane flight away from your facility. With all of these, record them, repurpose them, make them available for all the attendees to share with their coworkers and colleagues to help drive alignment. But this is the magic for lead generation to be competitive in a AI-centric world that we live in now for a data center operator that's facing a lot of competition and commoditization from all over the place, from their local market, from their regional market, national market, global market, in the product lines for co-location, managed services, cloud hosting, and disaster recovery. So that's exactly what I'd be thinking about. The more they come to your events, the more the know, like, and trust happens, the more the education and the trust building happens. From a logistics standpoint for the in-person events, give them 15, 20 minutes when they arrive to chat a little bit with each other and with your team members and have some breakfast. You have your 30 or 40-minute prepared session, which again should be so amazingly awesome that you're highly confident that you're going to get great reviews on those feedback surveys. Obviously, because it's small, it can be and can and should be super interactive and super participatory. Give them a chance to ask any questions that they didn't get addressed during the presentation part of it after you're done. And for anyone that's interested, take them on a tour of your facility afterwards. Lather, rinse, repeat. Your lead nurturing, your lead generation, your opportunity generation, a lot of things will take care of themselves simply by implementing this. If you're in a position where you're not technical enough to be the speaker, that's fine. Someone needs to coordinate all this. Someone needs to be the introducer, the moderator, the concierge provider. If you've tapped out all of your internal subject matter experts, after a while, invite outside guests in. Invite from your vendors that you work with. Maybe you have a relationship with Dell or Cisco or NVIDIA or something like that, and they're happy to provide their field reps to come in as external subject matter experts. If you have MSPs and contractors that you work with who could give talks on topics that are top of mind for your buyer personas, not everyone needs to be on your payroll. That's a speaker at your events. You could invite a couple of representative clients to come in and moderate a little panel discussion where you interview them, news anchor style. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, but at the end of the day, we want you and your team to be an integral part of their learning and development and professional development process to thrive, to survive and thrive in the self-driven buyer's journey where people are so incredibly sales allergic now. We got to get you in there early and often with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context. So we get you out of the vendor box and you're seen as teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, and the most senior people on your team will likely be seen as thought leaders. So that's what I'd be thinking about for how a co-location managed services, cloud hosting, and disaster recovery business can generate better leads. If you're getting good value so far from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button on whatever platform that you're watching on. What's up next? So we just talked about a lead generation use case for data center operators. Next, we're going to move over into the data center technology part of the ecosystem. And over at DCSMI, we track 22 different kinds of data center technology related businesses that are part of the 57 different business models in and around data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructures. So this particular question is about IT operations and incident response management. How can an IT operations and incident response management company attract very large MSPs, very large managed service providers? That is a terrific question. And it's a really interesting one as well, because of the qualifier in there is that the managed service providers need to be very large. The reality is, when it comes down to very large managed service providers, it depends on how you define very large. Are you talking about hundreds of employees, thousands of employees, or tens of thousands of employees? The managed service provider landscape, actually channel partners in general at that broader category level, with channel partners would include not just managed service providers, but value-added resellers, VARs, network integrators, master agents, consulting firms. They tend to be pretty small companies. Like, you can have a 50-person or 100-person company, and that in a lot of competitive segments, maybe one of the larger companies in your space. You get to a few hundred employees and you're in most of these segments approaching top 10% in terms of size. That said, there are a number of very large global consulting firms that also sell managed services. They just don't call themselves managed service providers. So if you look at firms as big as like Deloitte, EY, Cognizant, Accenture, they all sell IT services. They all sell managed services. None of them really position themselves as managed service providers. So we first need to get clear on that. Second, when we talk about very large, I think that's extraordinarily conducive to account-based marketing. What does account-based marketing mean? Is that we're not interested in boiling the ocean. We're interested in using like spearfishing here. We're not trying to attract thousands of leads from thousands of different companies. Then, depending on geographically where you're located and where you can do business, if you can do business globally, it's one thing. But if, let's say, for example, you're primarily focusing on North America or the US, or you're primarily focusing on Western Europe, Central Europe, maybe even all of Europe, maybe even Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and EMEA, you may find in your particular geographic market, there may only be a couple dozen companies that are very, very large that are providing outsourced managed IT services. So when we're talking about that your target account list may only be a couple dozen companies, we need to go super deep on our insights on understanding what's going on with there. And it's possible that it may go from a couple dozen to a few hundred. Again, it's not going to get to thousands if you're talking about very large managed service providers. That just aren't that many that are huge, that are hundreds or thousands of employees. So with that in mind, to attract people from those companies, generally the larger the company is, the more finely nuanced your personalization, your segmentation strategy needs to be. Like, we always start by defining the ideal client profile. In other words, we need to know geographically where they're located. And for this particular category, for IT operations and incident response management, you could potentially have clients all over the world, because most or nearly all of these services can be provided long distance. But again, your business model, your capabilities will dictate what you're going to do with that. Obviously, if you're selling, marketing and selling all over the world, and you need some initial face time to close, and you need some initial face time for onboarding and implementation, yes, you need to either have employees in that region or channel partners in that region, or be willing to travel. Even if you're not doing anything that requires face time in person, you still need to have staffing coverage available in those local hours. So these are all business model considerations of trying to figure out, like, your addressable market, the geographic side of your ideal client profile. Once you have that nailed down, when it comes to the size part of the ideal client profile, it's a very interesting consideration as well, especially if you're trying to attract very large managed service providers. Other things being equal, the largest of the large global IT services firms, managed services firms, tend to primarily sell to enterprises. Some of them have experimented over the years with selling productized services into the mid-market, and very, very few of them have experimented down into SMBs. But generally, huge IT services companies tend to sell to huge enterprise clients. So as a result, that's also another consideration, is trying to figure out, like, what's the ideal client size on the direct side where you've had success? What kinds of client sizes show up in your case studies page and your testimonials and your reviews and your logos? And what you likely will find is if you're looking for very large managed service providers, you're likely also looking for very large clients. Now, even if you're talking about the very large managed service providers primarily being channel partners for your firm, where they're an extension of your marketing and sales and services arm, you're still going to need to provide coaching, consulting for them on what works and what doesn't for your particular product line. So where I see people go off the rails in their channel partner aspirations is brand new companies, or companies that really don't have really rock solid product market fit and go to market fit, sometimes prematurely jump into having a channel partner program. And if you think about the life cycle maturity of companies that evolve, go to market, product market fit is the first domino to fall. That's knowing exactly who the ideal clients are, the products and services they buy from you, the price points, the frequency, all the basic unit economics. And that usually happens for a company in this at that particular business model. That'll usually happen sub 5 million in revenue, sub 50 employees. And in most cases, you're still doing founder-led sales at that size when you start to get answers on some of those questions. The next step beyond that is usually where you start to scale up your sales organization, where you're hiring your first couple of sales teams, you're seeing who's exceeding quota, who's struggling with quota, what kind of retention you have with your sales team, what kind of turnover problems you have with your sales team. Once you have all of that figured out, so you're highly confident that if you go to your investors and you say, hey, we need 10 million, 50 million to expand or whatever, and this is what our sales process looks like, this is what the retention looks like, this is what our unit economics look like, you know that when you go and you do a raise with investors, or you debt or whatever you're going to do to potentially accelerate the growth of your company, you know, with a high degree of confidence that the wheels aren't going to fall off, because you've figured out what it takes to successfully onboard, train, and retain your most successful members of your sales team. That's called getting to go to market fit. That's the next step beyond product market fit. And then once you have that in place, then and only then are you really in a good position to start talking about bringing on channel partners. Because if you go to try to recruit channel partners before you know how to grow your own sales organization, before you know what's working for your own marketing, before you know what's working for your own onboarding and services, how the heck are you going to coach channel partners on how to do this? Because remember, like, when you hire an account manager, when you hire a account executive, when you hire a field marketer, when you hire a product marketer, they're working for you 40, 50, 60 hours a week, full time. They're not distracted. They're not running in 10 different directions. When you go to bring on managed service providers, when you go to bring on channel partners, you're lucky if they're only paying attention to 5 or 10 other programs like yours at any given time. They may be paying attention to dozens of different programs at any given time. So in other words, you have a tiny slice of their attention. As a result, it is extraordinarily important for you to accelerate the value that they have with your company by filling in the blanks on some of these answers, so you're not using them essentially as lab rats. You shouldn't be running experiments on what's working and what's not working with your channel partners. You should have already figured that out if you want to be able to coach and advise and have good relationships with your channel partners. Once you have figured that out with your initial cohort of channel partners, and you get to the point that your channel partners are having success with marketing and selling your IT operations and incident response management solution, and they're onboarding new clients, and those new clients are successful, and they're successful over an extended period of time, and your channel partners are thrilled because you've grown their business and given them new sources of revenue and helped them own a greater share of wallet with their clients, Then you've gotten to channel partner market fit, the next step beyond go-to-market fit, meaning that just like with go-to-market fit, we're looking to see how long the average tenure is of your salespeople. With channel partner market fit, we're pretty much looking for the same thing, but on your channel partner side, like for your managed service providers. Usually the first tip off that you're in the right direction or wrong direction is you just go look on Sales Navigator, and are there people with job titles in your company that have the word channel or partner in their job titles? If you do, you're probably on the right track. If you don't, you're probably wishful thinking or very, very early on in this process. But that's just a basic prerequisite in order to get to actually channel partner market fit. Not only has there to be an absolute minimum of one full-time, obviously a lot more than that as you scale, people with channel or partner in their job title on the marketing side, on the sales side, on the services side. You also should be to the point that you have multiple referenceable channel partners sitting on the channel partner section of your website, talking about how much they enjoy being part of your channel partner ecosystem. These are essentially case studies of your channel partners. So again, that tells us that we're at channel partner market fit, assuming you've checked off all of those boxes: product market fit, go to market fit, channel partner market fit. You've earned the right to ask this question. If you haven't, I'd encourage you to go back to the drawing board and make sure you cover the basics. But with again, to attract these very large managed service providers, they're for sure, they will want to see that you have, generally for very large ones, you better have a hell of a lot more than one or two people with the word channel or partner sitting on your LinkedIn Sales Navigator, because very large MSPs are generally going to feel comfortable partnering with companies that are also relatively large. By relatively large, are they, if they have 10,000 or 50,000 employees, are they going to be comfortable partnering with a company with a few hundred employees? Probably. You don't need to be as big as they are, but they're probably not going to be super comfortable risking their reputation partnering with a company that has 5 employees, where there's not a single person sitting on Sales Navigator or sitting on the website that's a channel manager or a channel chief or something like that. So yeah, be self-aware about whether you're truly ready for relationships with very, very large MSPs. As long as you are, the name of the game with all of this is to understand in these managed service provider accounts, who are the kinds of people that you most need to build these deep relationships with. And generally, the larger the account, the larger the MSP you're selling into, the more buyer personas that you're going to need to be aware of, just simply because there'll be more stakeholders, more different kinds of roles on the decision committee, and in smaller companies, often a primary and a secondary buyer persona, and you're good to go. For this particular category, selling to very large MSPs, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a minimum of 5 or 6 different kinds of stakeholders in most of these accounts. And the way you figure out who these stakeholders are is look at your last few MSPs that you've brought on successfully and that you've retained, and look in your CRM and see what their job titles are, what their job functions are, who's had the most economic impact. That's going to be your primary buyer persona. Who's had the second most impact? That's going to be your secondary buyer persona. And then we need to study them. We need to understand the handful of their biggest goals, the handful of their biggest challenges, and prioritize who's going to have the most impact, who's going to have the second most impact. Tackle those first. That doesn't mean you don't need to tackle the third and the fourth and the fifth, but tackle the first and the second most important first. And make sure that you have a good lead generation program, a good way to educate and build trust with those folks. In most cases, events is going to be the predominant playbook: in-person events, virtual events, both, webinars, academies, podcasts. In terms of like what to talk about, I know you're probably dying to immediately just talk about how wonderful your IT operations and incident management response system is. And you'll get to that, but it's more important to catch their attention by talking about topics that are top of mind for them right now. Some of it may be incident management, some of it may be IT operations, some of it may be adjacent to that. In order to be truly client-centric, your events marketing strategy, your lead generation strategy should be focusing on meeting them where they are, meeting them with best practices and knowledge and professional development that helps them achieve their goals and overcome some of their biggest challenges that they know that they have. Not that you'd like them to have, but that they actually know and have articulated in their own words that they actually have. So that's the way to educate and build trust with those folks, and certainly attract those folks from a tactical perspective. In-person events, breakfast seminars, lunch and learns, webinar series, in terms of getting those invitations in front of the right people. We're talking about very large accounts. With very large accounts, there should be very large unit economics, meaning that with high lifetime values, hopefully your leadership team is realistic enough to have given you decent sized budgets that most things should be on the table. And if most things are on the table, I would for sure be using LinkedIn ads. I would for sure be using outbound email that's highly targeted to who they are and what they care about. And I would also be super careful to make sure that when you're talking about very large MSPs, they get invited to a lot of educational programs like the ones that you're going to invite them to. So it's one of the things, if you were just selling to SMBs, to less sophisticated, smaller IT executives from smaller companies, your internal subject matter experts may be adequate. As you get to larger MSPs and they're selling enterprise deals, they're going to expect next level in terms of speakers and value and insight. So deeply look within your internal relationships, your external relationships, your contractors, companies that you do business with, their subject matter experts, your clients. Like, there's definitely going to be some name dropping that you're going to want to do with bringing in some external experts. I don't think you necessarily need to be paying for experts. I know companies that spend a small fortune to have analysts relationships, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to have analysts that are able to do webinars with them a couple times a year. I don't think you need to get to that level. But I do think that if, for example, that there are companies that you're a channel partner of that are willing to supply speakers, I think if you have clients that frequently speak on panels at industry conferences or frequently interviewed on podcasts, all of these should be on the table for bringing in as guest speakers, for moderating as panels. And don't overlook that one of the most important things that you can do to build a funnel of future speakers is to have a great interview-based podcast. In this topic, in this particular segment, it can be a little challenging to get end users that are willing to, that are allowed to be able to step forward. But for sure, companies and vendors almost certainly have client-facing team members that are trained and allowed to speak at events and to speak at podcasts. And how will you know that aside from just asking people? Well, because they tend to jump in front of a microphone and anytime the opportunity presents themselves. You see them speaking at other conferences, at other people's webinars all the time. Either they have their own podcast or they're a frequent guest on podcasts. They have their own LinkedIn newsletter. You see them interviewed in trade publications all the time. But this is a very powerful way to attract and engage and educate and build trust with the right people and the right companies. The name of the game with all of this is, I don't have to tell you that IT professionals are incredibly technical, incredibly skeptical of anything having to do with sales and marketing, very cynical. So it's super important that we get you out of the vendor box and we keep you out of the vendor box. And the most important way to do that is to transform yourself from looking a lot less like a vendor and a lot more like a teacher, a consultant, a subject matter expert, a trusted advisor when it comes to anything and everything having to do with IT ops and incident response management. And the best way to do that is to make your training and development, your learning and development so incredibly valuable that they not only want to attend, but they keep coming back and they keep bringing more and more of their coworkers. So that's what I'd be focusing on for how an IT operations and incident management response company can attract very large managed service providers. We have to take into account that we now live in a world where 83% of the buyer's journey is over before you get to meet a prospect. The self-driven buyer's journey is a really big deal. It wasn't as big of a deal 10 years ago, but now you are literally in competition for their attention with all of the chat apps. Turns out a lot of people like talking to ChatGPT and Copilot and Gemini and Claude and Perplexity more than they like talking to a lot of members of your sales teams. And in order for us to compete with that, we need to go really next level on providing such amazingly specific, relevant, highly valuable professional development that they want to spend time with you and your client-facing team members that are subject matter experts about things that can help them get better at doing their job. So that's how I would address how an IT operations and incident response management company can attract very large MSPs, very large managed service providers. If you're getting good value so far from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button on whatever platform that you're watching. Be sure to rate and review us as well. So what is up next? Next question, what do we got? How does a data center infrastructure provider address managed IT services and cloud price competition? Oh, that's a good one. How does a data center infrastructure provider address managed IT services competition and cloud price competition? This is a fantastic one because it's something that I see happening constantly. So your company positions yourself as an infrastructure provider, and you're facing price competition. You're facing commoditization from managed IT services companies and cloud service providers on price. And what that almost always is a symptom of in terms of price is the ideal client profile, the go-to-market strategy could benefit from being tightened up to focusing on where you can win and provide the most value. And second, um, almost certainly need you to get in earlier in the journey to more dramatically shape the criteria that they use to evaluate the different options that are in front of them. Usually in this particular category, which is directly related to like being a data center operator, being a data center infrastructure provider, when you're facing price competition from managed IT services companies and cloud services companies, it usually means that you were completely invisible in the early and the middle stages of the journey, and you're only showing up at the end. The best analogy that I can explain is if you're even remotely casually into following any kind of professional sports, imagine going to a football game, a baseball game, a basketball game, a hockey game where the best players were locked out of the stadium for the first 3 quarters of the game. So if we're talking about like basketball or football or soccer, imagine that they missed the flight. Their bus got stuck in traffic on the way from the airport to the stadium, and they're using the fill-in players from the minor league team or high school students or something like that on the field as placeholders, so they didn't have to forfeit the game. But all of the best players, the ones that everyone wear shirts around with the less names on the back of those shirts and crowds them for selfies and autographs and everything all the time. The best players, the famous players, are locked out of the stadium and can't start the game until the game is like 80% of the way over. They did that because they didn't have a choice. Otherwise, they'd have to forfeit. But how likely is it that they fielded a competitive team when there's a competitive game going on at that point? Probably very, very unlikely, right? Because the other team, they had their act together. They got there early. They were ready when the national anthem was being played to immediately take the field. And they started immediately kicking butt because the other team was severely, severely, severely outmatched. When I think about a company like yours that's getting its butt kicked on price competition, what that usually means is you and your team missed nearly all of the game and you're only showing up at the end hoping for a miracle. And whether it's the screenplay or the book or the movie Moneyball or any one of a half a dozen types of blogs or cultural phenomena that have looked at this data, sports is so analytical now of being able to predict the players and the impacts and what they're going to do with measuring all the instrumentation and the analytics. So there's a similar kind of thing going on. Gartner found 83% of a typical journey, researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing now happens without you in the room. 83%. That means that if you still use the same playbook that you did 10 years ago, your best prospects, your best clients that you very badly want on your client list are getting their answers from someone else aside from your team in a self-service fashion until they're almost ready to buy. They've made up 83% of their mind at that point. So the challenge is if they've already largely made up their mind and you arrive too late, the only thing that's going to sway them most of the time is sacrificing your product profit margin, maybe even losing money on the deal to try to chase to the bottom, the race to the bottom. And most people know that's not the way you want to be building a business. Now, in that first 83%, they're still learning. There's still a strong need for professional development. And there are companies and teams and organizations that are dramatically changing, that are dramatically shaping the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different options in your category in data center infrastructure and managed services and cloud. They're inserting themselves into professional development and learning and development, which is more than likely what your company is going to need to do to get back into being competitive in this space. So there's a couple things going on. One is getting a lot sharper about your ideal client profile, because more than likely, if you're struggling with price competition, this isn't time to try to figure out how to be everything for everybody and win this price competition battle. No, it's about getting a lot more realistic on who your best clients are, who has the highest net promoter score, who generates the most revenue, who's the most profitable, and who you want more of that aligns with your current capabilities and what's on your roadmap for the coming months. So sharpening up that ideal client profile, knowing exactly where they're located, how big or small their companies are. So many companies in this space struggle with selling to clients that are either too small or way too big. And it's also really important to have clarity on industry, on business model match, on niche, because when it comes to data center infrastructure, in most cases, as you get into selling to highly regulated industries, there's depending on where you're located, there's accreditation, certifications, compliance issues that come up. And if you have that, great. That should be a huge part of your lead generation process and your go-to-market playbook. If you don't have it, that should also be listed, but as an exclusion, because when it comes to your outbound campaigns, when it comes to your ads, when it comes to lead generation, segmentation, qualifying, disqualifying, it's incredibly important that for your category, that you're not only situationally aware of where they're located, how big or small their companies are, and their business model, their industry, their niche. So once you tighten up that ideal client profile, let's say you become self-aware enough to say that we could sell to people globally, but we think we're going to do best with people that are in this particular country where we have presence, where we can have potentially in-person events in addition to webinars. And we're also going to be self-aware enough to know that, well, we've wasted a lot of time with companies that are too small to really afford what we recommend on the sales and the marketing side. So we're not talking anyone with less than 50 employees anymore, less than 200 employees. That's the floor. And conversely, we also, when we get more self-aware, we look at our CRM and we talk to our company leadership, we talk to our CFO, and we figure out, like, we'd love to be able to have Fortune 1000 clients, but the reality is once they get beyond about 5,000 employees, like, the demands that they have, we just can't meet today. So once you have that in mind, you may come to the conclusion that, like, okay, they need at least 50 employees to afford what we have. But if they're bigger than 5,000, they're going to bust our chops way too much when it comes to financial requirements, legal requirements, integration requirements, just flexing all the time with them, letting your team know that they're way bigger than you and they're driving the ship and there's too much revenue concentration. So you have that band, like, okay, it's this particular country, 50 to 5,000 employees, and we know these 3 or 4 industries are really good. These 3 or 4 industries are really bad. So that's the first part. The second part is from there, once you've defined that and gotten tighter with that, how can we attract them early and often? How do we get the heck out of the vendor box and keep you out of the vendor box? The key with that is transforming yourself from being seen as just sales or marketing or account management or product to instead being seen more as teachers, consultants, experts, trusted advisors, maybe even thought leaders when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center infrastructure. So in order to do that the right way, not only do we have to know that tight description of the accounts, we have to know in those accounts who are the key people that matter most that we need to educate and build trust with. And depending on the size of your company and the size of their company, if you're a relatively small company and you're selling to relatively small companies, you don't need very many buyer personas. You don't need a really robust segmentation strategy to hit 80, 90% of the core people. To a primary buyer persona, a secondary buyer persona, maybe a tertiary buyer persona for a channel partnership type of person, and you're good to go. If you're selling to mid-market and enterprise, it's possible there's 5 or 6 or more distinct kinds of people that weigh in on where this company decides to invest when it comes to data center infrastructure. The larger the company is, the more likely it is that you'll literally find people that have the word infrastructure in their job title, and they have a job function of information technology. I'm talking about LinkedIn Sales Navigator and LinkedIn Campaign Manager, where there's like job function is information technology. You can look for keyword like infrastructure. You can say, I only want people at a certain seniority level, like CXO, VP, partner, director, owner, something like that. This is where you'll be able to get a lot more specific on that. But it's beyond just the demographics. Is once we've identified and said, this is the most important economic stakeholder, this is the second most important, we need to study each of those segments and figure out their 5 or 6 biggest goals, their 5 or 6 biggest challenges, and the consensus on that. The better job we can do with that, the more likely it is that we're going to come up with a way to educate and build trust that really, really resonates. And that's the goal with all of this, is we need to educate and build trust in that early and middle stage of the journey, where we can help shape the criteria that they use to evaluate your category. From a tactical perspective, this almost always looks like some facet of hosting your own educational events. A lot of people get messed up when they say events and they immediately think to, oh, I need to go to the board and get a couple $1 million in my local currency equivalent so we can buy a big freaking booth at the biggest conferences on the planet. Well, you could do that, but the reality is most of the people that you want that FaceTime with for 45 minutes over the next 10 or 12 months, every single month, are not going to give you that kind of FaceTime at that kind of event, if they're even at that event in the first place. That's why I'm incredibly partial to owned events. It costs next to nothing compared to the cost of big national and global events. You can be hyper specific about who you're inviting on your target account list, on your topics. And most of all, that your CFO and your board will absolutely love is if you already have a classroom, if you already have a conference room, if you already have an email marketing platform and a CRM. Literally, your only out-of-pocket cost typically to run these events, if it's a breakfast event or a lunch and learn event, is bringing in some bagels and fruit and pastry in the morning, bringing in some pizza or deli or salads for lunch. And compared to the cost of flying multiple team members to a national and global conference, getting a booth and everything else that goes along with having that booth, your CFO will absolutely love that you're producing these events that pull in 10, 20, 30 of the perfect people, and your expense account has receipts for $375, period. And when you realize how impactful it is once you get this program up and running, if you're like me, be like, we should do this more often. Yeah. First week out of the month, you have your series for your primary buyer persona. The second week of the month, you have your secondary buyer persona. If there's a channel partner persona, like a tertiary buyer persona, maybe you're doing that the third week of the month. Sometimes they're breakfast events, sometimes they're lunch and learns, sometimes they're after work. Experiment with the times of days, experiment with the weeks, with the time of the week till you figure out what actually works best. But the cool part is your at-bats, your events can be run for so little expense that you can afford to do a lot more of them. At the end of the day, well, we want to put you in a position where you have a room that's filled up with people from your target accounts that are getting a tremendous amount of learning and development, professional development value from attending, so much to the point that they want to bring their coworkers back more and more each time they come. And this does amazingly impactful things for educating and building trust and lead generation and opportunity generation. So obviously, when you stack the decks in your favor, not only are you on the short list, it keeps you on the short list, your competitors start to drop off the short list. And for the most part, the price sensitivity starts to really fade away fast. So usually when people come to me and they're struggling with price competition, like from MSPs and CSPs, managed service providers, cloud service providers, as a data infrastructure provider, what it usually means is their addressable market, their ideal client profile is not dialed in enough. And second, that they're completely asleep at the wheel when it comes to educating and building trust, all of the educational event strategies that I just described. So if that playbook sounds like something that could provide a ton of value to your prospects and clients, go forth and educate and build trust. Get yourself out of the vendor box, stay the heck out of the vendor box, and be seen as the go-to experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center infrastructure, as educators, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, and thought leaders. So that's what I'd be thinking about for how a data center infrastructure provider can address managed IT services price competition and cloud services price competition. We're going to take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor, and then we're going to come back and tackle 3 more big questions right after our break.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and you're watching the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, our weekly live show where I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem. If you're getting good value so far from this week's show, make sure that you hit the like button to help spread the word. So what is up next? Next topic for this week that we're going to tackle is, how does a data center solutions company generate more leads? So your company is positioned as a solutions provider and you're looking to generate more leads. Typically, when I see companies that are positioning themselves as data center solution providers, it usually means that they have a basket of productized services that they sell that can be multiple areas among data center technology, multiple areas among data center facilities, or perhaps even some facilities related services, some technology related services. And even more importantly, even more universal for that kind of business model, you're usually a authorized channel partner of some kind of manufacturer or independent software vendor. So in addition to having revenue from reselling, some profit or revenue share from reselling of battery backup units or DSIM software, or cybersecurity software, whatever it is, in addition to having revenue as a channel partner, you're selling both initial and ongoing professional services that are usually an order of magnitude more profitable than the revenue share from just being a reseller or VAR or agent or whatever the definition is that their business model, your business model and their program has you categorized as. So the struggle that I see most companies that are data center solutions companies dealing with is depending way too much on riding on the coattails, coasting on the fumes of the companies that they represent. And this is an age-old problem. I've been working with IT channel companies for most of my career, going back literally like to the late 1990s, early 2000s. I would do these website reviews for companies that the channel partners that they were part of, that branding, that product information was actually way more prominent on their website than their own branding and their own information about their own company. And I still actually see this to this day. And if you consider your company a manufacturer's rep, which is probably the most like distributor-like kind of categorization that you could be, where you're primarily just reselling the product, then I guess some of this doesn't apply to you. And if you're profitable and you're happy, and then keep doing what you're doing. The reality, though, is in a self-service world and an AI-centric world where your clients and the companies that you work with are under incredible amounts of pressure to make you irrelevant, to disintermediate you, to bypass you completely. I wouldn't be in a very comfortable place right now if my company was solely known as a distributor or a manufacturer's rep, and I wasn't adding additional value beyond what they could get by completely bypassing me, buying self-service directly from the company. So with that in mind, typically the people that come to me want to move up the value chain. They want more profitable businesses. They want more gratifying engagements. They want to sell more of their expertise rather than selling a product, rather than just selling a box, rather than just selling a SKU. Because in a world where people are bypassing sales teams at record amounts, where like 83% of a typical journey is over before sales contact, I don't think companies that are primarily distributors and manufacturers agents have a very bright future if they're not doing massive scale, if they're not in an extremely, extremely overlooked niche, or they're not also offering, or if they don't also offer training and services that add significant amount of value beyond what the manufacturer can do themselves. I've already had people on the podcast from some of the large data center infrastructure providers talking, and we talk about like channel partners, and they're like, yeah, the channel partners are great for small and mid-sized companies, but the largest of the large companies demand that they can buy direct from us. Like, yeah, you're going to see that increasingly. And marketplaces are a really, really big deal that are upending decades of dominance of traditional distributors. And again, there's even this emerging category that's come out about the last 5-6 years ago with both transacting and non-transacting partner. What a transacting partner means is you're actually selling that product or service and you're earning a commission or earning a margin on it. And non-transacting partners means that you're a channel partner as well. You're some kind of IT services company, some kind of consulting firm, some kind of integrator. But you make your business model exists, your revenue exists, not as a result of the transaction, but because of the unique expertise that you bring to the table to help clients with achieving goals and overcoming challenges that they just can't do with their own internal talent, either on an ongoing basis, or a little bit of both. So for lead generation, what I'd really encourage you to do is to get hyper specific on the kinds of clients that you're selling to at the account level, especially the size, especially the industries, especially where they're located. And then think about who the key people are that are typically in on the sales decisions for these kinds of purchases. This almost certainly will show up in your CRM, your customer relationship management system, where you look at like your 10 or 20 or your top 100 accounts and figure out who the key people are and what their job functions have in common. This is like identifying and prioritizing your buyer personas. And from there, once you've identified and prioritized your buyer personas, we need to get super client centric. For a lot of companies that position themselves as just distributors or manufacturers reps, it's very common that you identify yourself through the lens of that relationship that you have with that particular vendor. The reality, though, is it's just not going to cut it in the world that we live in now, where your brand is really the only moat that you can possibly build. It's so much more important for you to understand the goals and the challenges of your clients than it is just to worry about becoming the partner of the year for the company that you're attached to. And the better job you can do with understanding the big goals and the challenges of your most important kinds of buyer personas, the more likely it is that you can come up with a lead generation strategy that really resonates and helps them tremendously, motivates those folks to want to spend a lot more time with your client-facing team members, because they don't see you as a vendor anymore. They see you as some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to anything and everything having to do with integrating data center solutions. So from a practical standpoint, if you're selling to really small companies, you're probably dealing with the IT leaders. If you're selling to enterprise clients, you're probably dealing with folks on the data center staff. And again, a lot of this is going to vary not only on size, but where you've done best. Like, for example, as a data center solutions provider, do you do better selling to enterprises that have their own data centers, or you do better selling to data center operators? And if you do well with data center operators, is it all data center operators, or is it more co-location providers as opposed to hyperscale, or is it edge providers or modular data center providers? Again, only you can answer that question, but I'd encourage you, in the hyper-competitive world that we live in, where people are expecting immediate gratification, 7 by 24 by 365 days of the year, I would strongly encourage you to really get hyper-specific about your ideal clients, your prioritized buyer personas, and get all of that figured out before you start worrying about your website, your lead generation offers, your premium content offers, your lead sources, your traffic sources, because one of the most important moats that you can possibly build is for your most important prospects and clients to see your client-facing team members as some of the smartest people on the planet. And in order to do that, by definition, it requires getting out of that vendor box and inserting yourself in a way where you're a huge part of those companies, those clients, those buyer personas, professional development and learning development. Because even though they're more sales allergic than they've ever been, they just don't want to spend time with sales at all if they can avoid it. ChatGPT and Copilot and Gemini aren't making it any easier on you. There's a lot of people now, especially not just IT and engineering folks, but just everyone that's preferring to have these conversations with the chatbots more than humans. So in order for us to compete with that and do better with that, we really have to provide something that's incredibly specific to who they are and what they care about. That's client centricity on steroids. So once you know those 5 or 10 big goals and challenges, essentially that's your events calendar for in-person events, for webinar series, digital events, both live and on demand, perhaps through an academy. And we're looking to educate and build trust with the primary and the secondary buyer persona, not just initially, but on an ongoing basis, early and often. If we think about like 28 touch points in a typical journey between complete stranger and purchase decision, I want you in there for most of them. I want you to completely dominate that surface area. So you earn your way onto the short list, you stay on the short list, and your education and your trust building, your training events that you provide for these specific people, these specific companies are so incredibly helpful that they have no time, energy, or inclination left to spend time with your competitors. When that happens, it is a beautiful thing. One of the categories, this particular category being a data center solutions provider that's primarily defining itself as a channel partner for the companies they rep, is one of the categories that I see struggling with this the most, which is a shame because it's one of the categories of the data center ecosystem that actually needs this the most. I interviewed I think he's either the CEO or the president or the owner, the leader basically of a data center power related company down in Texas, Tubbesing, Tubbesing on my podcast a couple of months back. And we talked specifically about the Lunch and Learn series, and they've been doing Lunch and Learns for years. And their Lunch and Learn program is such a huge part of their growth strategy that a couple of years ago, when the lease was coming up on their current office space that they had, they literally used a huge part of their criteria for the next office that you chose to move to grow from having a classroom that I think, if I remember correctly, Aaron saying was tapped out of 15, 20 people to the point now where in their current facility, they can host events with like 40 or 50 people. It's such a huge part, that monthly Lunch and Learn event. And if I was Aaron, if I was in there as the CMO or chief commercial, I'd say like, wow, if it's working well once a month, what if we segmented our list a little better and we try this twice a month? Could we do twice as better? Here's the thing, is like, if you think about the cost of being able to host events in your own facility where you don't have to pay for AV rental, you don't have to pay for $8 cups of coffee, like you don't have to pay for union reps, like any of this stuff. Like if you compare it to the cost of national and global conferences where there's no travel cost involved for your team at all, you're not paying inflated food prices. When it's your own facility, you literally can have people like stopping at Costco or Sam's Club or the supermarket or something on the way in and picking up trays of sandwiches and pastries and bagels and fruit and things like that. Like your cost for even 50 people could collapse to the point where it's less than $10 a person, less than even $5 a person in some cases. It depends on how elaborate you want to make, how nice of a spread that you want to put out. But my point with all of this is, compared to the cost of like going to a hotel or going to a restaurant, you have incredible amounts of control over that room. No one's kicking you out. Your cost structure is almost nothing. And it can have a game-changing impact on getting the right people from the right accounts and the right job functions to want to spend a lot of time with your client-facing team members and the subject matter experts at your channel partners and the companies that you work with, and potentially attending like customer panels where you moderate. The sky's the limit for what you can do with this educational event experience, but it can have a game-changing impact to getting out of that vendor box and staying out of that vendor box once and for all. I'm a big believer of recording all these events. There's always people that attend. They're like, my team lead should have been here. My NOC manager should have been here. My boss should have been here. Can I get the slides? Can I get a recording? Absolutely. These are all alignment tools. That's the goal of all of this, with getting in there early and often in the first 83% of the journey, is you're shaping the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different options that are in their category by being the one who's sharing the best practices and the methodologies with them in the formative stages where you can shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the category. How does this impact lead generation? Well, of course, they're going to register to attend the events. Every time they come back, it's another registration that's adding more data to your CRM. So you know who's registering, you know who's attending, you know when there's multiple people from these same companies, you know who's participating. And when you do this well, the know, like, and trust, the education and trust building should be phenomenal for your company. It's a massive differentiator for any data center solutions company that wants to survive the next 5 or 10 years. Like, if this isn't a core part of your playbook, I'd ask you if you're planning on shutting down the business or exiting the business in the next couple of years, because this is it. 5 or 10 years ago, this might have been a differentiator. This is the playbook to protect your company's future. This is how you build a moat around your company, by getting your most important accounts, getting your most important people in these accounts to spend a significant amount of their professional development time learning from your team members. So for a data center solutions company, regardless of whether you consider yourself a manufacturer's rep, a distributor, a VAR, a value-added reseller, a managed service provider, an integrator, or consultancy, if you haven't experimented with having your own events, what are you waiting for? Yeah, there's some time involved to set all this up and execute it. You get better and faster at it the more of these events that you do. But financially, the cost is, I don't want to say zero, but compared to other alternatives of things you can do, it's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction. And because of that, you can do a lot more of these. You can experiment a lot more. And once you get this up and running, for a lot of companies, this will end up being your primary go-to-market playbook going forward. So that's what I'd be thinking about for how a data center solutions company can generate more leads, and specifically more of the right leads. If you're getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you help to spread the word by hitting the like button, or review us and rate us on whatever platform that you're watching and listening on. So what is up next? Now we're going to get over into construction. This is a great question, a great topic that we don't get asked about all that often on the show. So this is the unique combination of construction and engineering, which means that you're able to get roots into facilities folks as well as data center developers and wholesale data center providers. So question here is, how does a data center construction and engineering company market and sell more cooling projects? Ooh, that's a great one. How does a data center construction and engineering company market and sell more cooling projects? So in case you're relatively new to the industry, over the last couple of years, cooling has become a really, really big deal. Why? Because the GPUs that come from NVIDIA that power everything having to do with artificial intelligence run so ridiculously hot that conventional methods of cooling data center halls just can't keep up anymore. So as different methods, alternative methods of cooling have come into play, it increasingly requires a different skill set, both initially and on an ongoing basis. And there's a couple of different approaches to how cooling happens. Liquid cooling that most people are talking about now involves, it's a crazy idea if you've been in the data center industry a while and I've never heard of this, but basically you're taking the servers and you're submersing them in vats or tanks of a special kind of solution that keeps the servers cool. And if you've ever been on a data center tour where the salesperson doing the tour, whoever was doing the tour, said, oh, you need to throw your coffee away or throw your bottle of water away, that's not allowed within 100 feet of the data hall. You know exactly what I'm talking about, that liquid and computers, liquid and servers don't mix. But this is the crazy thing that we ended up in this place over the last couple of years, where liquid cooling, where the servers are literally immersed in vats of solution to keep the hardware from overheating, has become a really, really big part of the playbook. And as a result, the skill sets required to construct the data centers it's quite different. It's not a traditional looking rack. You need plumbing expertise to be able to do this initially and to be able to support it on an ongoing basis. So yeah, when it comes to MEP, when it comes to construction, when it comes to contractors, when it comes to engineering, this is quite a different skill set. There's some companies too that are promoting this direct to chip kind of concept, where you still stay in like a more traditional rack, but you have these tiny little pipes of liquid that are brought in to cool the chips directly with a certain kind of solution. And again, they're subject matter experts who specialize in liquid cooling. They could run circles around my extremely primitive explanation with all of this. But the most important message with all of this is to recognize that there are not very many people in this industry who have 5+ years of experience in and around forms of alternative cooling. And as a result, one of the more innovative, powerful things that you can do from a go-to-market strategy is to package the expertise among your internal subject matter experts into professional development and learning development for the most important people that are trying to learn about these new alternative cooling technologies and what it looks like in terms of retrofitting an existing data hall, what it looks like in terms of construction. So this particular person that's asking this has a company that provides both construction and engineering, data center construction and engineering, and they want to be able to market and sell more cooling projects. So what I would do is I'd get really tight on that ideal client profile. I'd know construction and engineering projects, cooling projects, you need geographic proximity. This isn't like certain parts of digital infrastructure or technology where you can deliver these services initially on an ongoing basis remotely. You absolutely positively need geographic presence in that region for the site surveys, for the initial installation, for ongoing support and maintenance. So having employees in that region, having channel partners, contractors in that region is incredibly important. So think through that part of your geographic component of your ideal client profile as a construction and engineering company. Also think about size. These projects are expensive, which means that they're going to be out of reach for a lot of really small co-location operators, at least for now. So when it comes to like defining what company sizes you should be talking to about this education, you're welcome to educate and build trust with everyone. But the reality is, you know how expensive your minimum project is. Plan accordingly for your lead generation efforts. If you know, for example, that your minimum project just is not affordable for a company with less than 500 employees, don't spend a lot of resources educating and building trust with co-location operators that have 50 employees when they're nowhere near being able to afford your minimum. Work as efficiently as possible. So yeah, for sure, the low end of that employee range for your ideal client profile is really important. And conversely, depending on your company size, can you realistically sell direct to a data center developer or to a hyperscaler, or are you almost certainly selling to a construction company or to a contractor as a subcontractor? A lot of that will depend on how big your company is and how established it is. Generally, in order to be able to have these direct relationships, your company will likely need to be pretty huge. If it's more small to mid-size, in some cases, you may have direct relationships, but you also, if you want to get into the largest accounts, you may need to be open to being a subcontractor for the master contractor, for the general contractor who controls that particular relationship. So that will help you think through the size. Industry is a little bit less relevant because you're dealing with construction and engineering as opposed to dealing with the data themselves. From there, once you have clarity on where they're located and the company size, build out your target account list, depending on whether you're limited to just working locally or whether you can sell and service for your entire state or province or nationally. You may end up with anywhere from a few handfuls to a few dozen potential clients that you'd love to be doing business with on that target account list. And then within there, segment those target accounts and prioritize your primary buyer persona, your secondary buyer persona. Because when it comes to marketing and selling, what I highly recommend is getting clarity on the goals and the challenges of your prioritized buyer personas that are directly and indirectly related to data center construction engineering, and specifically dealing with cooling related issues. Because one of the best ways for you to market, sell, differentiate, and get in early and often is to get really client centric, get really prospect centric about what's going on in their world and how you can potentially become a key part of their learning and development and professional development process, both initially on an ongoing basis. I talk frequently about the idea of early and often. The often part is just as important as early. What does early mean? Well, Gartner found that 83% of a typical journey is now over before vendor contact. That means they're doing tons of research on their own before they ever get to you. Nearly the entire game is over before they're ready to talk to a salesperson. So getting in early is incredibly important to shaping the criteria and the early and middle stages of the research and decision-making process, when they're more sales allergic than they've ever been in the history of humankind. Often is incredibly important as well. Most typical journeys have a minimum of 25 to 30 touch points involved between complete stranger and purchase decision. So I want you to saturate that surface area with as many touch points as possible, so you're in on as many of those 28 touch points as you humanly can. From a practical standpoint, if for your prioritized buyer personas, you identify in each of those segments that there's 5 or 6 big goals they're working on, there's 5 or 6 big challenges, you end up with 10 or 12 topics, right? For each of those prioritized buyer personas. From those 10 or 12 topics, tackle one of those every month for the next 10 or 12 months in your monthly education series. Because liquid cooling is so new, because direct to chip is so new, there's a lot of value to being able to have people attend in-person events, but that's not always practical. If you're in a geographic area where it's practical for you to have a significant part of your addressable market, your ideal clients, drive to your facility, 30 or 60 minutes, absolutely positively run this educational event series in person. But if you're a pragmatist and you also recognize that in addition to the people that are local, there's a lot of people nationally that want to learn or that just aren't able to attend in person, for sure, take similar content and run it online as a webinar, the same slides. When you run it in person, you probably want to package it as something like a breakfast seminar or lunch and learn or an after-hour professional development event in the evenings. If you're running these as a webinar, a digital series, maybe it's a professional development series or a virtual summit or something like that, and always record. There's always going to be plenty of people that attend that they, like, my coworker should have been here. Do you have the recording? Do you have the slides that I can share with them? My boss should have been here. The name of the game with all of this is you want to be able to cover a significant part of the decision committee. And the best way to do that is we want multiple stakeholders from that company attending your educational events. But yeah, it doesn't matter whether you call it Cooling Academy, Cooling University, you customize it more for their particular business model and their particular buyer persona. But at the end of the day, take your deep subject matter experts and think about the goals and the challenges that your prioritized buyer personas are having and try to figure out a way for those two things to intersect. So they're not always going to perfectly intersect, and you want to meet your prospects and clients ideally where they are, not where you'd like them to be in a couple of months, but where they are right now. But at the end of the day, most of your prospects and clients need to keep their skills sharp and need to learn. There's certain goals that are sitting in their objectives and key results that are in their job description. They're sitting on their LinkedIn profile that's standing between them and a promotion. Maybe their individual goals, maybe their team goals, maybe their company's goals. And there's things that are driving them nuts. And to the extent those challenges, and to the extent that you can provide proactively a great professional development experience that educates and builds trust, helps them do their job better, helps them understand how companies just like theirs are tackling these. Again, think more learning and development and less infomercial. It's perfectly fine to host a breakfast seminar or lunch and learn where the first 15, 20 minutes they arrive, they have some time to chat with each other, network, have some breakfast or lunch, to sit down. You have your 30 or 40 minute program. These are relatively small events. There's probably a couple dozen people in the room. So plenty of time for participation, give them time to ask their questions at the end. And then once they're done, you give them the demo, you show them what it looks like in practice. If you happen to have it in the same room, go for it. If it's in your factory or you're in a warehouse, whatever you want to lab, wherever you want to take them around, you take them around and give them a tour. Do that early. Do that early. Like, it doesn't have to be a breakfast seminar, it can be a lunch and learn, but the goal is to intercept people as early as possible in their journey. So they're getting so much value from hanging out with your client-facing team members, your subject matter experts, your internal, your partner subject matter experts, your vendors, your clients, that they want to keep coming back to your educational events, and they keep bringing more and more of their coworkers. So you're meeting more and more of that decision committee and improving the likelihood that you're going to do business with that company in the near future. And you're proactively driving alignment in the formative stages of their journey when you can shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different data center construction and engineering options that can help them with their cooling projects. So that's what I would be thinking about when it comes to how a data center construction and engineering company can market and sell more cooling projects. And that brings us to our final question for this week, which brings us back into the realm of data center operators, data center providers. Oh, this is a great one. I've been on the receiving end of this one many times. So the final question is, how do we boost wholesale data center lead quality in a competitive market? So your company is a wholesale data center provider and you're struggling with lead quality in a highly competitive market. What do you need to do to turn the tables? The number one piece of advice that I'd offer for someone that's struggling with lead quality as a wholesale data center provider is you need to decide whether you're primarily in the real estate business or you're primarily in the digital infrastructure business. If you want to be primarily in the real estate business, you're almost certainly going to sacrifice an enormous amount of differentiation, enormous amount of competitive positioning, and enormous amount of financial margin by being exclusively in the real estate business. The wholesale data center providers that are better positioned, in my opinion, that are better differentiated, that have more pricing leverage, typically position themselves more as digital infrastructure providers and less as primarily just real estate focused companies. And when you start to see yourself more as a digital infrastructure provider, as opposed to just focusing on the real estate, you're able to become a key part of learning and development for those specific kinds of stakeholders that you want to reach. In most cases, it's like data center developers, construction managers, it's investors. There's 5 or 6 different core personas that can be really, really important. Depending on how large your project is, the one set of buyer personas that no one ever thinks about until it's too late is there almost certainly is going to be community stakeholders that are going to be buyer personas that impact your success as a wholesale data center provider. And if you're just focused on real estate and they don't see you as a technology focused digital infrastructure company, that is the first bad domino to fall for your company. So increasingly, I see a lot of companies that are data center developers that like wholesale data center providers, increasingly hiring 1 or more people on their team to focus on not like lobbyists where they're trying to brute force their way in, but focusing on community education. So they're actively building events. They're building educational resources for the 3 or 4 categories of stakeholders that can be make or break for your wholesale data center project going forward. These can be elected officials. These can be regulators. These can be executives at utility companies, and these can even be community activists. And you would think that the 4 kinds of community stakeholders have a lot in common. If you do this wrong, and if you're struggling with a lot of resistance, the one thing they may have in common is they're trying to block you. But when it comes to their motivations, they're quite different. The elected officials are career politicians. The regulators are usually career land use and energy kind of regulators. The people that work for utility companies have likely spent most or all of their career working for utility companies. And community activists, they're a little different. I spoke to a community activist several months back who her primary volunteer career, aside from raising family, is being focusing on bettering her community by having more responsible data center development. So they all have different motivations. One's political motivation, one has to do with protecting the sanctity of their career with regulating a particular industry. Another one has to do with representing the best interest of a utility company, many of which utility companies are publicly traded. And the 4th category is looking out for what they feel is the best interest of their community, kind of like a council person would be, or a board of education kind of member. But yeah, working on more grassroots efforts that in most cases is usually anti-data center development. So again, when it comes to improving lead quality, it's not just a matter of playing offense, it's a matter of playing defense as well. And these are complicated projects, which is why increasingly we're seeing developers hiring individuals, in some cases teams, that are responsible for educating and building trust and resources and events with all the different categories of stakeholders. Because on the surface, you're just going at this and saying, I need an anchor tenant. Okay, great. What does that mean? Okay, so we define it. And from there, the anchor tenant, you end up with an ideal client profile. You end up with a list of a couple dozen potential anchor tenants, and you start reaching out to them and trying to book meetings. The reality, though, is in most cases being able to capture better margins, better positioning, better differentiation in the marketplace, and most of all, protecting yourself from the forces that are working against your project going forward in the first place, almost certainly requires the same kind of efforts at content marketing, education, trust building, thought leadership that most of the other parts of the data center ecosystem have been at doing well for the better part of 10 or 15 years. A lot of data center operators that usually are partners or co-opetition with you, in some cases competitive forces with you, have been running this kind of playbook since the early to mid 2010s. Not all, but most, especially the ones that are a little bit larger that can afford to do this the right way, that recognize the extreme value of being able to own their own narrative, of being able to be in the driver's seat when it comes to educating and building trust with specific kind of segments about what they're doing. But none of that can happen if you're obsessed with just being in the real estate business. In order for you to have a chance of improving that lead quality, in order for you to have a chance of better competitively positioning, better differentiating, it really requires a mindset of seeing your company as a wholesale data center provider, as more of a digital infrastructure player, as opposed to just a real estate player. Obviously, there's a significant real estate component of what you're doing, but in order for you to really have the playbook where the leads are improving, both in terms of quantity and quality, and getting you the outcomes that you're looking for, it will almost certainly look a lot more like what co-location operators and hyperscale operators have been doing reasonably well for the better part of 10 or 15 years now. So I have this conversation sometimes as well with executives at co-location operators, where there's some co-location operators who've allowed themselves to be commoditized because they just focus on real estate as opposed to being real estate plus the high margin amenities, the IT services. It's kind of a parallel version going on here. Now, as a wholesale data center provider, you're not going to get involved in IT services, but being able to change the perception so the marketplace sees you as more of a digital infrastructure partner as opposed to just a real estate developer can have a very, very game-changing impact on dramatically improving lead quality in a highly competitive marketplace. Now, I once in a while too get people to come to me and say, we have no competition. We have the only affordable utility grid power that's available within 100 miles for the next 10 years. And if you do believe that you have monopolistic pricing power, maybe none of this matters. But if you're in a highly competitive market and you have to contend with not only a couple dozen direct and indirect competitors, but you also have to contend with some detractors who have varying degrees of detractedness. I don't know if that's even a word, but some external community stakeholders that are more on your side as opposed to being less on your side, then yeah, for sure, being that digital infrastructure company as opposed to just focusing on the real estate aspect of what you do can have an enormous impact on lead generation, lead nurturing, and how it positively impacts your business motion as a whole going forward. So that's what I'd be thinking about for boosting lead quality for a wholesale data center provider, a competitive marketplace, is really dial in that ideal client profile, get your target account list built, figure out who these personas are, both the obvious personas and the less obvious community focused personas. And you almost certainly very badly need a content and events marketing person if you're a very tiny company or a small team to be able to execute this kind of playbook well on an ongoing basis. Ironically, one of the things that you may not need as much as you think you need is massive booths at large national and global conferences, because what you're doing is so hyper focused that instead of going to an event where 95% of the people in the room aren't remotely anywhere near your ideal client profile or the prioritized buyer personas, once you figure out that target account list and that ICP, the companies they should come from. And once you figure out your prioritized buyer personas, the roles are. So more than likely in your highly competitive marketplace, they probably work at one of a few dozen companies. And there's probably 10 or 20 people in each of those companies that really matter. So your universe size is 300 or 400. If you can get 25% of those 300 or 400 people coming to one or more educational events that you host over the next couple of months, dramatic impact in accelerating the know, like, and trust and getting you out of the vendor box. So you're not just seen as the real estate developer, but instead seen as the digital infrastructure company that's going to have a game-changing impact on the competitive landscape and the availability of affordable power and cooling and telecommunications infrastructure and responsible grid usage within the constraints of what's available. If you, by the way, have a play on alternate energy, if you're a wholesale data center provider that has anything to do with like liquid natural gas or hydrogen fuel cells or nuclear, then it's incredibly important that you get out of just positioning yourself as a real estate developer and lean very heavily into thought leadership and being seen as trusted digital infrastructure partners in your local community. And again, for the playbook that works really well in this space, is just simply look at what other data center operators and other data center technology companies have been doing well for the last 10, 15 years. For some reason, construction and real estate were really, really late to the game and recognizing a lot of this, but rest assured you're selling to the exact same buyer personas that they are. No one is getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning saying, gee, I really miss the phone book. I got to go collect a bunch of phone books around. That's how I'm going to figure out who's going to be my wholesale data center provider is, I haven't seen that big trade journal that used to come in the mail 15 years ago. I really hope they resurrect that business model and bring that back. Because if I just got that biweekly trade journal delivered 26 times a year, I bet it would give me the perfect answer on who to select for my wholesale data center partner. Those are as much in the rearview mirror as BlackBerries and fax machines at this point. We need to live in the present. We need to recognize that even baby boomers have dramatically changed how they research and make purchase decisions when it comes to anything and everything having to do with digital infrastructure. And the more clear you are about that ideal client profile, the core buyer persona is what's top of mind for them. And the faster you can transcend from just being seen as a real estate company to being seen as a real estate company who also specializes in digital infrastructure, game-changing impact on the quantity and quality of your leads, even in highly competitive marketplaces. So that's what I would be thinking about for how a wholesale data center provider can boost its lead quality in a highly competitive market. So that was our final question that I'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching, and we'll add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming episode. If you want to stay in the loop and get invited to upcoming educational events just like this, be sure to subscribe to our Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter. That'll get you notifications direct to your email inbox on Sundays. You can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg, founder of the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn and you'd like to be, make sure when you send me the connect invitation that you mention in the body of the invitation that you watch or that you're a big fan of Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, and I'd be happy to be connected with you on LinkedIn. I'm so glad that you were able to join us for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. We wish you great success in growing your career, your team's impact, and your company's impact in this amazing period of growth that we're going through right now within the global data center, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure marketplace. Look forward to seeing you back next week. Take care now.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.